In the early 17th century, the world of a younger brother was bleak. If you weren't the eldest son, you were pretty much out of luck. John Earle, a writer and cleric, described it best: younger brothers were at the mercy of the world. They either ended up joining the church, or worse, they took the King's Road, a path that led to a life of aimless wandering, debauchery, and often a trip to the gallows at Tyburn. Imagine being in a dark, damp cell at Newgate Prison, waiting for the hangman's noose. Your only hope for a reprieve would be to beg your older brother, who had inherited everything, to use his wealth and influence to get you a royal pardon. But even if you were lucky enough to get a pardon, the relief was short-lived. You'd still be searching for a purpose in life, maybe even joining the war in the Low Countries, where poverty and disease were common, and dying without a shirt on your back was a real possibility. This was the fate that awaited George Villiers, a younger brother in a family that was already struggling. His father, Sir George Villiers, died suddenly in 1606, when George was just 13. The family was left with crippling debts, and the estate went to George's older half-brother, William. Mary, George's mother, had no land or wealth of her own, and she was left to rely on the generosity of her hostile stepson. Mary wasn't just a common woman. She came from the Beaumont family, who had once been Earls of Leicester. But by Mary's time, the family had fallen into obscurity. Her father was a squire, and she had been sent to live with a wealthier relative, Henry Beaumont, where she worked as a waiting woman. It was there that she met George Villiers Sr., a distant relative who had recently lost his first wife. He was a man of ambition, known for enclosing land and evicting tenant farmers to graze sheep, a practice that made him rich but unpopular. Despite the age difference, Mary was in her mid-teens, and George was in his 40s. They fell in love. George was smitten with Mary's beauty and offered her money to buy a dress. She accepted, and they were soon married. Their first child, Samuel, was born in 1690, but died after only a month. 4 more children followed: John, Susan, George, and Christopher, known as Kit. But life was hard. John had a condition that made him prone to violent fits, and Kit suffered from a weak mind. George himself was often ill, but he had a charm that made him stand out. He was handsome, athletic, and charismatic, with a confident manner that was both attractive and disarming. Mary doted on George, seeing him as her hope for a better future. She spared no expense in raising him, even though the family's finances were stretched thin. They hired a personal musician and a tutor to prepare George for a life of status and influence. But in 1606, everything changed when Sir George died suddenly, possibly from the plague. Mary was left a widow, and her children were at risk. Susan was unmarried, and the boys had no prospects. They faced a bleak future, either joining the church or taking the King's Road to ruin. In the same year, Shakespeare's acting company, the King's Men, came to Leicester. They performed a play called The Malcontent, which was a scathing satire of the new Scottish king, James I, and his court. The play depicted a corrupt and decadent court, filled with favorites who were more interested in their own pleasure than the good of the kingdom. The audience in Leicester, who were worried about the influence of the Scottish courtiers in London, would have found the play both shocking and relatable. The play began with a warning. The old freedom of the pen allowed the playwright to criticize the court, and the audience was in for a ride. The first scene was set in a noisy, out-of-tune chamber, where the main character, Malvol, a deposed duke, was disguised and trying to reclaim his title. The court was filled with corrupt officials and minions who were more interested in flattery and pleasure than in governing. The language was blunt and shocking, with references to Ganymede, Juno, and smooth-chinned catamites, all hinting at the homoerotic relationships that were a source of scandal in the royal court. For George Villiers, the play must have been a stark reminder of the world he was entering. With his father dead and his future uncertain, he would soon have to navigate a court where favor and ambition were the only currencies that mattered. But George was no ordinary younger brother. He had a charm and a presence that set him apart, and he was about to embark on a journey that would take him far beyond the shadow of Tyburn's tree. Mary Villiers found herself in a precarious position after her husband's death. Now a widow with no property to call her own, she was living as a tenant at Godby Marwood, the estate where she and her late husband, George Villiers, had once been the masters. Her stepson, who had inherited the property, was not exactly welcoming. making her life even more difficult. Despite these challenges, Mary was determined to secure a better future for her family, especially for her son George, who she believed could rise to prominence in the royal court. One of the ways Mary saw to achieve this was through a strategic marriage. She set her sights on Sir William Reynor, an elderly widower in his 80s with a significant fortune and no male heirs. Sir William had been a friend of her late husband and was owed a substantial debt. Some whispered that Mary had used her charm to win him over, while others claimed he had been pursuing her. Regardless, they were married, and Mary hoped this union would provide the financial security and connections she needed. However, Sir William proved to be less supportive than Mary had anticipated. Within weeks of the wedding, he fell ill and moved to his estate at Orton Longville. Seeing an opportunity, Mary and a group of loyal servants traveled to Stanton, where Sir William was convalescing. They broke into the house, using false keys and picklocks, and stole £2,000 in cash and £300 worth of wool. The wool was to be sold in Leicester, but Mary's plan was foiled when Sir Robert Pierpoint, a friend of Sir William, intercepted the cart and returned the goods to Stanton. Despite his illness, Sir William took action. He drew up a will excluding Mary and her children from his inheritance, leaving everything to his daughter, Elizabeth. Mary attempted to challenge the will, but her efforts were unsuccessful. Elizabeth, with powerful connections, brought a case against Mary in the Star Chamber, accusing her of conspiracy, fraud, and embezzlement. The charges were serious, and the court was the highest in the land, presided over by the Privy Council and the country's most senior judges. Mary, however, was not easily intimidated. She argued that she had taken the goods to pay overdue taxes. The outcome of the case is not recorded, but Mary's resolve only strengthened. She managed to secure a quick conclusion to her daughter Susan's marriage negotiations, finding her a suitable husband, William Fielding, despite the high dowry required. Mary then turned her attention to finding a third husband for herself. Sir Thomas Compton, a log merchant, seemed an unlikely candidate at first. He was described as low-spirited and backward, but Mary saw potential in him. His brother, William, was a prominent figure at court, and Sir Thomas's connections and rising fortunes made him an attractive match. They were married in late 1607, and Sir Thomas's courtly connections helped Mary advance her son George's prospects. George, who had shown little interest in academic pursuits, began to flourish in more social activities. Mary focused on developing his conversational skills, dancing, and fencing. At 16, George was sent on a journey to France with his brother John, where he spent 3 years. During this time, he acquired a sophisticated and polished demeanor, influenced by the French court. When George returned to Godeby Mawood in 1612, Mary was thrilled to see the transformation. She spent a year grooming him further, ensuring he was ready for the next step. In late 1613 or early 1614, she decided it was time for George to head to London and seek his fortune at court. The journey from Leicester to London was long and arduous, covering 78 miles. George followed the well-trodden route along the Fosse Way, passing through High Cross and eventually reaching the outskirts of London. The city was a sprawling metropolis, a mix of grand palaces and crowded slums. As he approached, George saw the hill of Mount Calvary, topped by a windmill, and then the gentle slopes of the Thames Valley, offering his first glimpse of the capital. The final stretch of the journey took him through the squalor of the city's slums, past the stench of the meat market in Smithfield, and finally to the Saracen's Head Inn, his destination. After washing off the dust, George made his way to the Palace of Whitehall, the King's London residence. Despite the grandeur of the city, Whitehall itself was a disappointingly ramshackle complex of buildings, with the Holbein Gate serving as the main point of entry. For George, who had traveled so far and seen so much, the palace might have seemed underwhelming, but he was determined to make his mark. His mother's ambitions and his own talents would soon lead him to the heart of the royal court, where he would find the opportunities and recognition he sought. George Villiers arrived at the Palace of Whitehall, a maze of 2,000 rooms designed to bewilder and amaze. To the guards, he was just another provincial outsider, but his connection to Lord Compton got him into the presence chamber, where hopefuls waited to catch the eye of the king's inner circle. The courtiers noticed George, but they saw him as a country bumpkin in fancy French clothes. They didn't take him seriously, which gave George a chance to slip through the cracks. Sir Roger Aston, a close friend of the king, had recently passed away, leaving behind his wife and 4 daughters. Anne, the youngest, and George quickly fell in love. But Anne's guardian, Sir William Reynor, knew the Villiers family well. He had lent money to George's father, who had squandered it. Reynor saw George as a fortune hunter and set impossible terms for the marriage. George had to deposit a large sum of money as security, and Anne would receive no dowry. Despite the obstacles, Anne and George were determined. Anne insisted she would marry him regardless of what her friends said, and George declared that she was the only reason he stayed at the court. But their love was about to face a bigger challenge. Sir John Graham, a senior courtier, noticed George's charm and saw an opportunity. The court was dominated by Scottish favorites, and there was a growing resentment among the English. Sir John thought George could be the perfect candidate to restore the balance. He encouraged George to focus on the king's favor rather than Anne. King James was a restless man, always on the move. He would travel the country in grand progresses, staying at the homes of local nobles. One of his favorite stops was Apethorpe, the estate of Sir Anthony Mildmay. In July 1614, James was on his way to Apethorpe when he received news that King Christian IV of Denmark had arrived unexpectedly at Somerset House. James rushed back to London, where the 2 kings drank and feasted, causing a stir in the court. When James finally settled at Apethorpe, the mood relaxed. On the evening of August 4th, the tables in the hall were set for a grand banquet. George, dressed in new livery and acting as an extraordinary cupbearer, stood nervously behind the door of the garderobe. Sir John Graham had arranged for George to serve the king, a risky move that could have disastrous consequences. James, despite his unimpressive appearance, was a good companion. He was erudite, sensitive, and generous with his affections. As George approached with a gilded flagon and an embroidered napkin, the king's interest was piqued, but then disaster struck. While carrying a tray of meat, George was bumped by another cupbearer, causing food to spill on his new clothes. In a fit of anger, George confronted the other man, giving him a slap. The act caught the attention of Robert Carr, the king's current favorite. Carr, feeling threatened by the newcomer's growing favor, demanded that George's hand be cut off. But to Carr's surprise, the king intervened and pardoned George, much to Carr's frustration. This moment marked a turning point for George. His charm and audacity had caught the king's eye, setting the stage for a rise in the court that would change his life forever. George found himself at the center of intense curiosity, as King James's royal progress made its way to Nottingham and Oxford. People couldn't help but notice the young man, describing him as not only outwardly beautiful, but also inwardly charming. His elegant frame, sweet disposition, and delicate features were the talk of the town. One admirer even stared at him for half an hour, trying to understand what made him so magnetic. Another was completely overwhelmed by his beauty, from his nails to the soles of his feet. Thomas Erskine, Lord Fenton, who had known King James since he was a boy, noticed the king's growing infatuation with George. A few weeks after their first meeting, Erskine wrote to a cousin about an unknown youth who was gaining the king's favor. He mistakenly thought George was just a local boy from Northamptonshire. In November, a vacancy opened up for a groom of the bedchamber, a position that involved intimate and regular contact with the king. Sir John Graham, a gentleman of the bedchamber, saw this as an opportunity to bring George closer to the king. However, when he recommended George for the role, King James flatly turned him down, leaving both Sir John and George bewildered and hurt. The reason for James's rejection soon became clear. In a long, emotional letter to his current favorite, Robert Carr, James expressed his deep hurt and confusion over Carr's jealous behavior. Carr had been acting strangely, filled with unquietness, passion, and even insolence. He had appointed his own kinsman, William Carr, to the position Sir John had sought for George, without the king's knowledge or permission. This made James feel betrayed, and forced him to refuse Sir John's recommendation. James's letter to Carr revealed his deep dependence on his favorite. He promised never to allow anyone to rise in his favor without Carr's approval, and he reassured Carr that anyone who did would have to acknowledge and thank him. Despite this, Carr's response only made things worse. He claimed that he no longer felt any affection for the king, and would only act as a dutiful servant. In the midst of these dramatic conflicts, George was almost forgotten. His brief moment of glory, which had brought him close to the king and the court's glamour, seemed to fade away. Fortune had passed him by, and he became desperate to regain his place. He was seen at a horse race in Newmarket, hoping to catch the king's attention again. But without the support of his former sponsors, he was just another face in the crowd, dressed in an old, tattered suit, and sleeping on a trundle bed at a local gentleman's house. The atmosphere in London during the winter of 1614 to 1615 was tense. King James, who had been on the English throne for a decade, still struggled to settle in. He continued his restless travels, hunting, hawking, and feasting with his friends, while neglecting public concerns and running up huge expenses. The public mood had soured after the death of James's son and heir, Henry, Prince of Wales, in 1612. Henry had been a beloved figure, and his death left a void that Robert Carr seemed to be filling, much to the resentment of many at court. Carr, a young man from a Scottish aristocratic background, had risen quickly to become the king's favorite. His fall from his horse during a jousting competition in 1607 had captured James's attention, and the king had spent hours by Carr's bedside, fussing over him. James's infatuation with Carr was evident, and courtiers began to whisper about the nature of their relationship. Carr, aware of the king's fascination, carefully cultivated his appearance and manner to maintain his favor. He changed his tailors and dressers frequently, wore the latest fashions, and learned to talk about the king's favorite horse, all of which only increased his appeal. As Carr's influence grew, so did his power. He was given lands, titles, and political roles, much to the chagrin of English courtiers. By 1613, he had married Frances Howard, a member of one of England's most powerful noble families, and secured his position as Lord Privy Seal and Lord Chamberlain. His rise had made him arrogant, and even the Howards found it necessary to flatter him excessively. By the time King James returned from his summer progress in 1614, a group of grandees, including William and Philip Herbert, the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, decided to take action against Carr. They met at Baynard's Castle, a fortress on the Thames, to plan their strategy. The idea was to introduce a new favorite to the king, someone who could distract him from Carr. They chose George Villiers, who had captivated the king during the summer progress but had been forgotten. The plan involved using entertainment to win the king's favor. The king, who had been in a low mood, was invited to a performance by three master fools, Sir George Goring, Sir Edward Zouch, and Sir John Finett. They put on a bawdy show that included a mock joust by the king's dwarves, David Droman and Archie Armstrong, which made the king laugh. Once the king was in a good mood, George was brought in, dressed in magnificent new clothes provided by the Herberts. The king's eyes lit up at the sight of George, and a few weeks later, he was invited to participate in a grand Twelfth Night Masque. Ben Jonson, a renowned playwright, wrote the masque, titled Mercury Vindicated from the Alchemists, specifically to showcase George's beauty and charm. The masque was an extravagant affair, with elaborate sets and costumes, and the king agreed to contribute a significant amount of money to the production. While the play's language was complex and elusive, the real purpose was to rekindle the king's interest in George and bring him back into the royal fold. The snow had barely melted from the London streets when the court began to stir with the promise of spring. But the icy tension between Robert Carr and the newcomer, George Villiers, showed no signs of thawing. George, with his charm and natural grace, had won the king's heart. But Carr, entrenched in his power, was not about to give up without a fight. On a cold, crisp morning, George stood in the Queen's chambers, dressed in the fine linens and clothes his sponsors had provided. The room was filled with the court's most influential figures, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot, and the Herbert brothers, William and Philip. The Queen, Anne of Denmark, was a formidable presence, her eyes sharp and her resolve unwavering. She had always been a woman of strong opinions and even stronger will, and she was determined to see George rise in the king's favor. James, the king, entered the room, his face a mix of curiosity and unease. He was a man who had seen much in his life, from the brutal politics of his Scottish upbringing to the opulence and intrigue of the English court. Anne, rising from her bed, asked her son, Prince Charles, to hand her his rapier. The king flinched, memories of past violence flashing through his mind. But Anne, ever the strategist, revealed George from behind a tapestry. The young man's presence was magnetic, and the king, captivated by his charm, immediately knighted him, using Charles's sword to bestow the honor. The room erupted in a mix of applause and whispers. George, now Sir George Villiers, was sworn in as a gentleman of the king's bedchamber, a position that brought him closer to the center of power than ever before. Carr, learning of the news, was furious. He implored the king to demote George, but the Herberts, with the Queen's and the Archbishop's support, convinced James to stand firm. Sir George was now a full gentleman of the bedchamber. In the days that followed, George's star continued to rise. He sought out the Archbishop, grateful for his support and eager for guidance. Abbot, a shrewd and experienced man, gave George pious yet practical advice: to pray for the king, to support the king's relationship with his wife and son, and to always speak the truth. George promised to follow these lessons, but the Archbishop, with a touch of regret, noted that such promises often faded quickly in the cutthroat world of the court. A month after George's promotion, the court gathered for the investiture of 2 new Knights of the Garter. The candidates were William Knowles, a veteran courtier with ties to Carr's allies, and Thomas Erskine, the king's Scottish groom of the stool. George, sensing an opportunity to challenge Carr's influence, joined Erskine's entourage. The court buzzed with speculation about which candidate would have the more impressive following. Despite Knowles's strong backing, it was clear that George's support for Erskine was a bold move, a statement that the new favorite was here to stay. John Chamberlain, a keen observer of court life, wrote to a friend in Holland, predicting that Erskine would bear away the bell. He noted that Erskine had the support of the best part of the court, and 100 guards in new, rich coats, all thanks to Sir George Villiers. The ceremony was a resounding success for Erskine, and it marked a significant shift in the balance of power at court. As the spring sun began to warm the cold, damp streets of London, George's rise to power was undeniable. He had won the king's favor, the Queen's support, and the admiration of many at court, but the road ahead was far from easy. The court was a place of constant intrigue, and George's success would be tested again and again. Yet for now, he stood at the pinnacle of his new life, a young man from humble beginnings who had captivated the heart of a king and changed the course of history.